The University of the West Indies places high priority on preserving your health and safety. Please give me your attention for a few moments as I outline the emergency procedures to be followed at today's event. This building is equipped with a fire alarm system, and in the event of an emergency, the alarm will sound. Please note that we have no planned drills for today, so if the alarm sounds, we will treat it as a real emergency. Once the alarm has sounded, or in the event of an emergency, calmly make your way through one of the exits. This lecture theatre has 3 exits, 2 to the front of the theatre, 1 at the middle of the room. There are 2 additional exits to the side of the room, and these exits are labelled as emergency exits. Only open the emergency exit doors if the alarm sounds or there is an emergency. Once outside the theatre, make your way to the assembly area, which is at the back of this building, east of your present location on the field. Stay at the assembly area point and await further instructions. In the event of an earthquake, stay calm. There are no tables under which we can cover. Keep low, hold on, and look out for falling debris. Once the shaking stops, exit the building in a calm and orderly manner and assemble at the assembly area where you will receive further instructions. Thank you.
Good afternoon again, everyone. For those who came in after my initial introduction, I am Catherine, Research Assistant at the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. I'm also a Transport Planner and Transportation Engineer. I'm here now to introduce Ryan Darmanie, our main speaker for this afternoon. He's an urban planner and urban design consultant with a interest in urban revitalization, sustainable development, and human-scale design. He's a graduate of the Colgate University in New York with a Bachelor of Arts degree in computer science. And then he went to Rutgers University in New Jersey, where he gained a master's degree in city and regional planning. He has 8 years public and private sector experience, and he's a regular columnist in Sunday Newsday. He's an active advocate for local reform in urban planning and design, and he's been doing this for several years. His focus lies at the intersection of socio-economic and environmental issues that are at the heart of urbanization and interventions that are needed to balance the urban ecosystem. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Ryan Darmanie in the usual manner.
Thank you, Catherine. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm just going to get straight into the presentation. All right, so the topic of the talk today is interventions for rebalancing the urban ecosystem. So just quickly, 3 reasons why I thought this presentation was necessary. The first reason is that I think that as a planning profession, we have sort of lost sight of the importance and the nature of cities as complex, interconnected systems. Secondly, because of that, what we find right now is that we have a lot of specialists trying to do the job of generalists. And because of that, I think that we are making some very disastrous urban planning decisions with long-term consequences. So I'm going to start talking about the city for a bit first. And I like this quote from Edward Glaser. He's an urban economist at Harvard University. And he says, cities have been engines of innovation since Plato and Socrates bickered in an Athenian marketplace. The great prosperity of contemporary London and Bangalore and Tokyo comes from their ability to produce new thinking. Wandering cities is to study nothing less than human progress. So cities have been important throughout history for a number of reasons. One is economic reasons. Cities have facilitated commerce and the innovations that have made a lot of human progress possible. Second is a very practical reason, safety, protection from the wilderness, from wild animals, from invasions, from foreigners, and also, I guess, from criminal activity, because cities, as they develop, tend to develop law and order and rules and regulations. But sort of as a side effect of that, I guess, cities have also enabled cooperation among humans, a collaboration, and sort of a development of a civic life in the cities themselves. So cities have sort of been bringing people together for thousands of years. And of course, when you bring lots of people together, there are bound to be problems because people bring with them problems. So when you bring people together in cities, you're going to find problems, right? So what could possibly go wrong? So I think that to understand how to deal with the problems of cities, we need to think about what a city is and what types of problems cities present. So for this, I turned to the late urban planner, Jane Jacobs. She spoke about the way that scientists were dealing with, the way that the types of problems, that they were trying to solve, right? So they started off being able to solve simple problems. Simple problems basically are two variable systems. So for instance, you can think of how does the volume of a gas change when the pressure increases or decreases, right? That's a two variable system. So these types of problems are easily analyzed because they're more or less just dependent on those two variables. But what she says is that what they did was they then jumped to trying to solve problems of disorganized complexity, where you had a lot of different variables and an unmanageable number of variables. And to solve these types of problems, they basically turned to statistical methods, right? And in the middle there, you have what she called organized complexity. We have a relatively large number of variables. They're all interconnected. And she says they're sort of akin to biological systems. So they're somewhere in between simplicity and disorganized complexity. So they're sort of like an ecosystem, right? So what happened in the history of city planning, I guess 1890 is sort of a pivotal moment. And what we had was, he was actually a court reporter named Ebenezer Howard. And he came up with this concept of the garden city. So at the time, London, at the time where he was living, was basically very dirty and crowded, and it was just horrible living conditions. And so instead of trying to figure out how to fix the issues in his city, he decided that it would be better to move people out of the city. And as Jacob says, he didn't like the idea of large agglomerations of people getting together. So he didn't like the city really from the get-go. And so his prescription for the city was basically to start building these new sort of satellite towns outside of the city, and we would sort of redistribute the population of London. And in these satellite towns, basically, they would be self-sustaining towns. And what he did was that he, as she says, mistook cities to be problems of simplicity. So in planning these towns, he started looking at simple ratios of things. So for instance, the ratio of how many housing units you had to how many jobs you needed to provide. How much commerce you had to provide as a ratio of the housing, how much green space or greenery as a ratio of the housing. And his sort of thinking sort of started to influence, many years later, the people that she referred to as the decentrists, so people who were sort of against the idea of decentralization of people in cities. And later on, the ideas, in a sense, sort of became corrupted and sort of gave us suburban sprawl in many ways. But some of the ideologies that came out of the garden city, one, this idea of the compartmentalization of cities, where one part of the city would serve one function. So this would be where people live, this would be where they recreate, where the commerce would happen. The idea of the nature fix, sort of, if you move people out into nature, you sort of get rid of all the problems of the city, right? Nature sort of fixes everything. Anti-density, because in his mind, these cities were not supposed to grow beyond a certain population limit. And when that happened, what he was supposed to do was build a new satellite town, essentially, right? So this was supposed to be carefully managed. And then the idea of static planning, which I think it has major implications for us. So this idea that once a plan is done, the plan doesn't change, or the neighborhood doesn't change, right? Because his towns weren't supposed to grow beyond a certain size. So that has kind of found its way into our urban planning mentality a lot. When we look at, let's say, single-family neighborhoods, where people think, oh, well, this neighborhood is not supposed to turn into a multi-family neighborhood. We don't want apartments here. It's supposed to stay like this, and the character is supposed to remain. So then Jacobs came along about 60 years later, and basically she said, no, that's wrong. Cities are more like an ecosystem. She says cities are problems in organized complexity, like the life sciences. They present situations in which a half dozen or even several dozen quantities are all varying simultaneously and in subtly interconnected ways. The variables are many, but they are not helter-skelter. They are interrelated into an organic whole. Let's see this, please. I just have a little video here for you.
If you want to see what kind of a city can flourish, you need to look at the cities where it's happening. There must be a lot of diversity, continually building up, diversity of kinds of work, diversity of kinds of people.
She revealed the way to create better cities is by working with the people who live there and the fabric that existed. The traditional fabric that people inhabit.
There have to be areas of the city which people use a lot, walking on the streets, and use at all times of day.
Jane understood neighborhoods need lots of connections, short blocks, lots of turns, allowing different kinds of interaction. Neighborhoods need a mix of buildings, old and new. They need diverse uses 24/7 so that they're safer. Constant connection with neighborhoods around so that you're not isolated. You need public spaces that are accessible to people.
It's all a great network in a city. It's all related.
She observed these early qualities at a time when housing was being built in completely the opposite direction. They were isolating communities. They were creating dead-end streets. They were separating work uses and recreation and residential uses.
She was explaining how life worked.
So basically, it's not simply ratios of one thing to another that tell you anything meaningful about a city. So if you know that a city has a particular amount of green space per resident, it doesn't tell you anything about the health of the residents. It doesn't tell you if they actually use the green spaces. So there's far more, there are other things that you need to know about the city. You can't just plan those things in those ratios and think you're going to have a great city. So basically, Jacob started observing city neighborhoods. She started with Greenwich Village in Manhattan, which is where she was from. And through observing, she came up basically with a theory of cities, basically, right? So most people know Jacobs for these 4 recommendations that she made about thriving urbanism or how to generate diversity in cities. And basically she was saying that these 4 things, once you get these 4 things right, these are the 4 cornerstone things. Everything else can fall in place after that. So the first thing is mixed uses, meaning that the different neighborhoods in the city must be used for more than one thing. So they can't just be all residential or all commercial. You have to have a mix of uses. When you have mixed uses, she explained, that leads to safety because you have people using the streets at all times of the day because people use different uses at different times of the day. And it also leads to more pedestrian-friendly cities because places are closer by. So you can walk to the grocery store, you can walk to work. She said cities need a mix of old and new buildings. This one has mostly to do with economics, as she explained, because old buildings, she said new ideas require old buildings. Old ideas, established ideas, can go into new buildings. So what she's really trying to say is that new ideas, so entrepreneurs, they need lower rents. And because older buildings, they've already paid for themselves, the mortgage has already been paid off and all that, they can be rented at lower cost than newer buildings. Right? So she was looking at it from an economic point of view. The next thing she says is that cities must have short blocks and the streets must be highly interconnected. Again, for walkability, but also for contact, so that people are constantly in contact with the people around them on the streets when they're walking. And then she says cities need a critical mass of people that is a high enough level of population density. And that has to do with generating vitality or activity on the city streets, also for safety, because if you have activity on the streets, the street automatically becomes safer. And also for convenience, because the more people you have living within a particular area, the more services that area can support, right? So there's more commerce it can support because there are more potential customers for the restaurants, for whatever it is that's there. So these are just 4 examples of things that I think that Jacobs would have viewed as good urbanism. The first is in Boston, Massachusetts, And the second is in what Frederick should used to look like. The third is in Japan, and the fourth is contemporary Port of Spain. This is down by the National Library. And I think each one of these pictures shows different aspects of what Jane Jacobs was talking about. Whether it's mixed uses, whether it's the blending of the old and the new, which is done really well in the fourth picture, whether it's density, so lots of people, well-connected street systems. Port of Spain has a really nice grid system. Most old cities have a really nice, well-connected street system. And I chose pictures from different parts of the world to show that sort of these qualities are fairly universal. I mean, there are certain differences, but these major qualities are fairly universal. And cities have sort of evolved in this way organically over time. That's just how people have naturally come to use space. I guess the heart really of what Jacobs is talking about is the role of streets and the role that streets play in sort of connecting everything in the city.
There was this emerging idea that crowded urban areas where people were kind of hanging out on the street, on their stoops, where there was a lot of poverty, that the way to deal with that problem was to effectively get rid of the streets. It was effectively to eliminate that sidewalk culture and build projects that would make it impossible really for people to kind of cluster in public in that way.
So I want to make this point that a road is not a street, right? I mean, sometimes we use the two words interchangeably. Sure, both allow for circulation, but a street really plays more of a role in more of a social role than a road does. In terms of safety, right? Because if you have people walking on the sidewalk, then the city becomes safer. You have that natural surveillance from the people walking on the sidewalk. Contact, because the sidewalks allow for contact between strangers on the street. Socialization. And Jacobs actually talks a lot about children and how children sort of learn how to behave from adults on the street that they encounter on the street. So if you have children playing on the street, and adult passes by and sees them doing something wrong, it kind of corrects them and sort of teaches them, well, no, that's not how you do this and that. Right? So she's really looking at this as a complete, interconnected system, and we don't look at planning in that way anymore, I think. So the second approach really was sort of born out of the Garden City and what it sort of devolved into, I should say. 4 images again. The first image shows those areas that are only made for shopping, so West Mall. The second one is low density, only residential areas. The third one is these, what they call the tower in the park model of development, where you have these towers surrounded by green space, but there really is no connection between the building and the sidewalk, because the building is set back so far from the sidewalk, right? So it's almost this idea that if you're in a situation where you have to create high density, you have to do everything to mitigate against it and make it look like it's actually not high density, right? So you add green space because green space solves everything, right? The fourth image is interesting in that if you walk along that sidewalk, it's Briar Place, I believe the name of the building is. If you walk along that sidewalk, as a pedestrian, you can't really see what's going on. There's a patio on top there, but you can't see what's going on that patio because of the retaining wall. Right? The people who are sitting on top can kind of look out and see, but you yourself can't see that. So at eye level, what you're seeing really is just a blank wall. And I think it represents a form of anti-social design, really, where you're trying to sort of protect the people using the building from the horribleness going on the street, basically, right? And I think these 2 images really sum up the differences between the 2 approaches. The first one, this is a building in San Diego in a historic district called Little Italy. And the second one is 1 Woodbrook Place, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. When I look at the first one, I sort of get a feeling of this place is sort of inviting. It's a sense of warmth, a sense of, it's welcoming people to use the space in front of the building. Whereas when I look at 1 Woodbrook Place, I get a sense of it's just cold, it's like it's trying to set itself apart from its context. particularly in how far the building is set back from the rest of the neighborhood. It's completely out of scale of the neighborhood. There's no sort of coherence in the architecture of One Woodbrook Place and the architecture of Woodbrook, the architectural history of Woodbrook. It's completely out of scale in terms of height. Nothing in Woodbrook is nearly that tall. So it just completely sets itself apart from the neighborhood. Whereas in the first image, although it's sort of a contemporary architectural design, it does take cues from Mediterranean design. So it does fit into its context a little bit better. I mean, notice the cypress trees out in front there. All right, so let's talk about the urban planner. So instead of seeing the city as a connected ecosystem, the urban planners, in my mind, sort of succumb to the theories and thinking from some complementary fields of study. And it sort of upended the attitude towards cities. And I think that has been detrimental to us. So when I think of myself as an urban planner, I really think of myself as a jack of all trades in a sense. I'm not an architect, I'm not an economist, I'm not a sociologist, but I do understand bits and pieces of all those different fields, and I have to find a way to sort of assimilate it. Much like a family doctor who is not a specialist, right, but has to understand all the different parts of medicine. So this is a great example from an urban planner named Jeff Speck, and he outlined this example in his book Walkable City. So he gives an example of looking at designing a street. So he says, okay, you have all these different stakeholders and each one something that's supposed to satisfy their needs. So the engineers are going to ask you for 4 travel lanes for the cars and a center turn lane, which is going to take up 60 feet. The business owners are all going to ask you for angled parking because they know people don't like to parallel park, right, on either side of the road, so that's going to take up 40 feet. The bicycle advocates are going to want separated bike paths at each curb, 16 feet each. The urban foresters, right, the green people, are going to want 2 continuous tree trenches on the sidewalk, 20 feet each. The pedestrian advocates are going to want 2 wide sidewalks, 40 feet in total. So when you add it all up now, you get a street that's 176 feet wide. And as he says, it's just as efficacious an urban environment as a large jet runway, and just as conducive to shopping, right, if you try to satisfy everyone's needs. So these are just some of the complementary fields of study that sort of influence what urban planners do. And they're color-coded for a reason, right? They're color-coded in terms of the level of influence, I think, right now where we are, locally at least. I think that we have let traffic engineers dictate a lot of urban planning, and also the environmentalists. And I say environmentalists because, well, you'll see why I say that. Also, we've allowed a lot of past problems in public health to dictate what we're doing now as well. A lot of past problems, like what I mentioned with Ebenezer Howard back in the late 19th century, and sort of this idea that cities are sort of dens of disease, and so we shouldn't allow them to get too densely populated, right? And certain segments, I would say, in architecture, in particular, modernism, but I would specify not modernism in architecture, but modernism in urban design. I think those two things are quite different. So what are some of these bad decisions that we have made as a result, right? And I want you to think back to the point I made about the importance of social contact in city, and how when you have this social contact between people, you sort of are able to mitigate against some of the negative effects that come from bringing people together in such close proximities, right? Because people, they get to know each other, they get to figure out how to get over their differences, right? So cities allow for these things to happen. All right, so this is actually a direct extract from something we call the Guide to Developers, right? It's a publication that Town and Country Planning has put out some decades ago, really, and it's still being used. And in it, they outline how to lay out the streets in a subdivision, right? They say one is less desirable, one is more desirable. So the less desirable one is the more grid-like interconnected system, right? It's the less desirable one. Some of the reasons, I don't know if you can read up there, but it says proliferation of access points to the main road, monotonous layout, right? The second option, which they think is better, There's a hierarchy of roads. They say limited access to arterial roads. More interesting layout, right? And also, when town and country planning, when you apply for the subdivision of land, one of the conditions that they write into their approvals states, proposed roads must be designed in such a manner as to permit integration with the existing road network. Alternatively, proposed roads must end in a cul-de-sac. I'll let you guess which one people tend to choose when they're laying out a subdivision. So I want to take this example here and show you, because this is actually a project I worked on recently for a client. The client had a very large parcel of land just south of these points A and B. Now, the black line on top is the priority bus route. And one of the things that we know in transportation planning is that people are willing to walk a particular distance to a transit stop, right? It tends to be about a quarter mile to a half a mile, depending on the type of service provided at the transit stop. So basically, this development had the opportunity to provide what we call a transit-oriented development, right? Where you would have, I guess, higher density node in a development, and people would be able to walk to the transit stop. Although we don't have transit stops yet, but if we're going to implement a system in the future, we have to be thinking about these things now, right? Okay, here's the problem. There's a subdivision just to the north of that large parcel of land. The direct distance from the parcel of land to the priority bus route is about 7 minutes walk. Because there's no direct access in the road network to get from that land to the priority bus route, the walk then turns into about 14 minutes, which is sort of outside of the realm of what people are generally willing to walk to get to a public transit stop, right? Look at points A and B. These are two houses that share a rear wall, basically, right? If one needed to get from house A to house B, one would need to follow this red path, then the pink path, just to get to his neighbor, basically, your neighbor, right? So my question is, are you really neighbors? I mean, you're sharing a rear wall, but are you really neighbors when you're that far away, right? So when we start laying out communities in such a way where there's not a highly connected road network, we're setting ourselves up for a lot of problems. And this example of this development I worked on is showing how we're almost like, as they say, transit-proofing our neighborhoods, because it's going to be very difficult to come and retrofit and be able to provide efficient public transportation when you have systems like this, because all the distances are exacerbated. Another thing that has resulted is, I mentioned before, the compartmentalization of uses. So I like this slide because the dotted circles, I don't know if you can see the dotted circles on the pictures, really show the same distance, basically, I think a quarter mile or a 5 minute walk. And it shows that in the typical traditional city, right on the right, these are all the things you'd be able to get to in a 5 minute walk. Why? Because the uses are mixed and the scale of things are much smaller. So you have a lot more different things going on. Look at where you'll be able to get to in a 5 minute walk in the typical way that we lay out subdivisions and strip malls. Everything is supersized, right? So in a 5 minute walk, you're basically walking around the perimeter of the strip mall. You're not getting anywhere, so walking is just not useful. It's not practical. Another thing that's resulted is an antipathy to high population density. So on the left, your typical single family home that we love to build here. I chose the image on the right for a particular reason, because I think it's very misleading when you start to look at how we've been building these multi-story towers. It looks like we're using land more efficiently, right? Then look at all the open space on the ground that has to be used for parking. If you start to actually look at what the density, how many units per the area of the lot that are actually there, it's actually not that high, right? We actually aren't using land that much more efficiently. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that we have to provide so much surface parking everywhere. So parking is just eating up all the space. And of course, the pedestrian as a second-class citizen, right? So because everything is so spread out, now you have to connect everything with automobile infrastructure. And then, of course, who takes precedence on the roads? The cars. So as an afterthought, okay, let's build a walkover for the pedestrians. Guess what? Pedestrians don't use walkovers. Not here or anywhere in the world. It's not a Trinidadian thing, it's just a pedestrian thing. It's a human thing. People will try to cross a road naturally, looking for the shortest path. And then this idea, again, of the nature band-aid, right? And this idea that you have no streets. So because you have no streets and you have bad urbanism, you have no social contact, well, let's just add greenery everywhere and it's just going to fix everything, right? So these are two illustrations of developments. One, well, both are for HDC actually. One is in somewhere in Eastern Tunapuna, I believe, St. Augustine, and the other one is a proposal that was supposed to be done by the Chinese for at Lady Hills in San Fernando. And again, you see this thing, the tower in the park, right? These tall buildings that are completely out of scale with everything around it. There really are no streets in any of these developments. It's just green space, driveways, and parking. And this comes to the idea of anti-social design. I kind of talked about the one on the left before. The one on the right is just another example. I mean, if you're familiar with that RBC building in St. Clair, you know how far that building is set back from the sidewalk, right? So what is the overall effect of all of these things? Well, just to recap quickly, street system and road design, we have long circuitous routes with dangerous traffic speeds, land uses, separated and spread out land uses, which exacerbate travel distances, low population densities, which leads to inefficient use of land and low street activity, and anti-social design, which leads to a lack of street life. In other words, anti-pedestrian development. Now, I'll kind of go through this part just quickly, but I wanted to just show that these decisions that we're making and in terms of how our cities are structured have implications far beyond what we would think, I think, in general, right? So let's talk about the economic implications first. There are many studies that show that population density is positively correlated with productivity. So the more densely populated an area, a city is, the more productive the population is. Sort of digging deeper into that, there are studies that even show measuring how walkable a city is. Walkable cities tend to have higher GDPs per capita, right? That particular study said the reason is that they're able to move more people more quickly, and therefore they're more productive. And ideas share faster because people are constantly in contact with each other, right? In a nutshell. There are even studies that showing when you develop cities and you have a very dense urban core, as opposed to the density of the city being spread out over the entire area of the city, the dense urban core provides higher productivity. And you get a sort of a supercharged effect on the productivity the higher the education levels are of the people in terms of tertiary education who live within that city, right? And another study I looked at, which is quite interesting, when we think about innovation today, we tend to think about places like Silicon Valley, right? This study showed that, in fact, cities, although they produce today less patents than places like Silicon Valley, the patents that they do produce, right, often lead to more disruptive economic impacts. And they also tend to be more interdisciplinary. So there are a larger number of collaborators who produce these innovations that are patented, right? This, I think, is very, very important, and I think something we do not talk about locally at all. And it has to do with the cost of urban sprawl. This study was done by the London School of Economics, and they found annually, 2015, that urban sprawl costs the United States $1 trillion every year. Right, $1 trillion. Out of that $1 trillion, basically 626 billion is paid for directly by the people who live in these communities through their taxation. But the other 400 billion is paid for by people who do not live in these communities. Their taxes are subsidizing these people through the development of roads and other infrastructure and the provision of services. Why is that happening? It's happening because if you have low density development, the tax revenue that you can generate from that low density setup, because you're using land so inefficiently and you require so much infrastructure to support that development, the tax revenue cannot pay for the infrastructure, right? So I don't know what's been going on here. I suspect maybe the government over the years have been using the revenues from the energy sector to prop up and fill that gap. I don't know, but as our situation changes, certainly that's something we need to be cognizant of. Also, as we have local government reform going on and property taxes are being reintroduced and localities are expected to raise revenues, this is something we need to start thinking about. I like this diagram because it shows really the realistic situation. So everybody wants low density development. Everyone wants to live in a single family house in the suburbs, right? But they also don't want to pay high taxes, and they also don't want more density in their neighborhood, right? So this shows that, okay, if you want low density and you also want low taxes, then you're going to have to get service cuts. You're going to have poorer services, right? So less reliable fire services, less reliable police, or poorer infrastructure, whatever, right? Because something has to give. If you want low density, but you want all the great things, then you're going to have to pay high taxes. If you want stable services, all these great things, but you also want low taxes, then you're going to have to accept higher density, right, to generate the revenue to pay for everything. Another important economic implication is housing affordability. There's this really interesting work going on now where people are looking at the cost of housing and transportation, as opposed to the traditional model of housing affordability that looks at housing alone. And in the traditional model, they say that you shouldn't pay more than 30% of your income on housing, right, for it to be considered affordable. What they're finding, though, is that transportation costs have risen so much. This comes from the US, but actually I think it may be even greater here because our incomes are far lower than the US comparatively, and the cost of vehicles are actually higher because we have to pay all these import duties on them. So I think it's actually exacerbated more here. So basically, when they started comparing cities, looking at the cost of housing plus transportation, they started finding some very interesting things. Sort of the most extreme thing that they found was that New York City, which is considered a very expensive place to live, right? People pay most people pay a little over 30% of their income on housing, right, on average. They only pay less than 8%, however, on transportation because of the great subway system. They compare it to Phoenix, Arizona, where a lot of people from the New York City and the northeast of the US move to because they think it's more affordable, right? They pay less for housing, but because everything is so spread out, they end up paying a much larger portion of their income on transportation. So much so that they ended up paying more in combined costs than people living in New York City, right? So I think that's really important. And the last figure I saw said that the average household income in this country was roughly $11,000 a month, right? That's the average household income, not individual household, right? And consider the cost of cars. And this ad keeps popping up on Facebook, so I thought I would put it here. Okay, this is some Kia, and Kia Rio is probably one of the cheapest new cars that you can get, right? Okay, the agent for Kia is advertising and saying that all you need is a salary of $5,200 a month to qualify for the $1,700 payment. That alone is basically a third of your income, right? So this is just to tell you how ridiculous things have gotten and what we have created as urban planners and allied professionals who have allowed the situation to get to the point where people need to buy a car. A lot of people need to buy a car, but we haven't considered the fact that cars are that expensive and our incomes are low. And it's going to place an extreme burden on the younger generation in particular, right, who already don't know how they're going to afford housing, right? Something that we don't think about, tourism. How does the way we develop cities impact tourism? In 2015, Resonance Consultancy, which is a pretty respectable tourism consultancy firm, did a report on Trinidad. And basically they said that, the contrast between Trinidad and Tobago, which we kind of know, puts them in a position to become a capital of leisure, right? A mixture of business and leisure, which we've been hearing for a long time, which in turn could attract millennials, right? Who personify generation leisure. Well, what do we know about millennials? In 2017, Resonance found out that millennials, within the next 24 months, those surveyed, it's almost an equal split. Basically 40% of them said that they plan to travel to an urban destination. 40% said a beach destination, right? So it's a sizable amount of people who are traveling to urban destinations or cities. Okay. What are their motivations for travel? When they were asked, 55% to interact with the locals, 46% experience everyday life, 43% increased knowledge. So these were the highest reasons, right? So what does that tell you? They're looking for sort of an authentic experience when they go to these places, right? How do you get that authentic experience? You want to meet locals and you want to interact with them on the streets, right? It doesn't help if, the place isn't pedestrian friendly and basically you're just being shuttled from your hotel to somewhere else. So it's a lot more authentic if you're actually walking on the streets using the public transportation that people are using. I mean, when I go to New York, that's one of my joys is to use the subway system and to just interact with New Yorkers. I find them to be very entertaining, and that in and of itself is a boon for tourism. And they say that millennials are far more likely to travel internationally, and as I said, they prefer urban destinations. Why not directly related to tourism? I thought the study from the University of Surrey in the UK is quite interesting, because basically what they said is that when people interact with people on foot, they have more positive notions of those people, right? When they drive by them and see them in a car, they have very negative feelings towards them, right? So in other words, when you're in a car, you view everything else negatively that's going on outside of the car. And that's important for tourism, I think. It's important for how people perceive the destination that they're in. Let's go this quickly. Some social implications of the way that we develop cities. This study basically showed that upward mobility is higher in cities with less sprawl. So more compact cities, basically, the better chance you have at moving into a higher income bracket or higher socio-economic status, basically, right? Because a lot of it has to do with accessibility to jobs. In more compact cities, you have easier accessibilities and more jobs, which means you have a better chance of upward mobility. So if we plan everything around cars, then this is an outcome, because people are very good at crashing their cars, right? And a friend of mine actually took these pictures, right? And sadly, they've actually, I think, raised the speed limit around the Savannah now to 65 kilometers per hour. So I think the second image on the right was actually taken after that increase, right? So are we going to start seeing more of that? I don't know. But if you think about it, I mean, I feel very uncomfortable as a pedestrian walking on the Savannah, and cars are zooming by at almost highway-like speeds, and I feel like something's going to crash into me now. There are health implications, but
And weight, of course, impacts health. But we've only started talking about inactivity, and how inactivity, born of our landscape, inactivity that comes from the fact that we live in a place where there is no longer any such thing as a useful walk, is driving our weight up. And we finally have the studies, one in Britain called Gluttony versus Sloth, that tracked weight against diet and tracked weight against inactivity, and found a much higher, stronger correlation between the latter two. Dr. James Levine, in this case the aptly named Mayo Clinic, put his test subjects in electronic underwear, held their diet steady, and then started pumping the calories in. Some people gained weight, some people didn't gain weight, expecting some metabolic or DNA factor at work. They were shocked to learn that the only difference between the subjects that they could figure out was the amount they were moving. And that in fact those who gained weight were sitting on average 2 hours more per day than those who didn't. So we have these studies that tie weight to inactivity, but even more, we now have studies that tie weight to where you live.
So what Jeff basically goes on to say, in a nutshell, is that there are these things they now call obesogenic neighborhoods, I think I have the term correct, where they've been able to directly correlate where you live to weight, and using something called Walk Score, which is a website that basically rates almost everywhere in the world right now the walkability of neighborhoods. And places with a higher walk score are more walkable. And the higher the walk score goes, the lower the average weight of residents is, right? So there's a high correlation there. What about the environmental implications? And this goes back to why I said I put environmental science in quotes, because I think the environmental movement within planning, locally in particular, is very similar to what happened in the US a while ago. And it's sort of what's been called an Arcadian movement, right? So where basically cities are seen as the antithesis of environmentalism. So there's not that recognition that cities actually can help the environment, because it means that if you're staying compact, you're not destroying virgin land for more development, right? And there are other environmental benefits as well. So this is from the latest United Nations Environment Program Emissions Gap Report. Just some quotes. Automobile-oriented suburban sprawl is the least sustainable model of all, right? Short journeys in cities account for 2/3 of transport emissions in urban areas and could be replaced by active modes. Short journeys, remember remember the map I was showing you about how short journeys can be exacerbated by how we lay out the street system, right? So look what that's contributing to. Then they go on to say future floor area demand is a crucial variable for greenhouse gas emissions, and more intensive use can result in significant reductions of both material and energy related emissions. Basically, they're saying that single family homes require a lot of material to build. A lot of energy is expended in single family homes to keep them cool through air conditioning because they're larger. They use more resources, water to wet the lawn, more electricity, more everything, right? As opposed to apartments, which are more energy efficient. All right, so the last part where I just talk about the interventions that we need to make, right? So I believe that by focusing on walkability and making places more pedestrian friendly, we can begin to start rectifying a lot of the things that have gone wrong, right? So what do I mean by walkability? So the degree to which the human environment is designed to encourage and cater to the needs of pedestrian circulation. It is an end and a means as well as a measure, which really means that the end goal should be to create a more walkable community. Having a more walkable community is a means to achieving other things, right? A means to becoming more sustainable, a means towards having a healthier economy, a means towards having healthier citizens. And it's also a measure of how far you've gotten there. So how walkable your city is a measure of how far you've gotten to achieving those goals, right? So how do you facilitate walkability? To this I turn to Jeff Speck, who I spoke about before, and his book Walkable City. I've read a lot about what makes a city walkable. I think Jeff really does a great job of simplifying it into 4 key components. The first is that the walk has to be useful, basically. So walking should allow you to easily access daily amenities on foot. The walk should be safe. Pedestrians must be and feel safe from being hit by an automobile and the fear of criminality. Comfortable. Buildings and landscapes shape streets into an outdoor room and protect against the elements. So I'll get into that a little bit more, what that means. Interesting, active streets lined with beautiful buildings that show signs of humanity, right? Because as they say, humans are social species and nothing interests us more than seeing other people. So what really controls the way that cities develop, right? And in my mind, it's a zoning code. So for people who are not planners, I'll tell you, a zoning code is basically a document that contains the rules and regulations that govern how one can develop land, with particular types of development being confined to particular areas. So in Trinidad, we don't really use the term zoning for whatever reason. I can't tell you why, but what we do is very much akin to zoning. Zoning is a term it's used in North American context, but it's also the most widely used way of regulating land uses, right? A few places do it differently. The UK does it a little bit differently, but they are really in the minority. Zoning is by far the most common thing that people use to regulate land use. And as a planner, I believe that zoning is the single most powerful tool that we have, right? So we can go and we can write plans for areas, and we can put all this great flowery language in a plan and say, oh, we want Port of Spain to be this vibrant city and it's going to be safe. Okay, what does that really mean? That has physical connotations, right, to how the city looks and functions. But what controls how the city looks and functions? It's the zoning code, right? So in a sense, while we spend a lot of time on coming up with these plans, which is necessary, at the end of the day, if the zoning code is not allowing for a particular form of development that allows those things to materialize, then what's the point of a plan, right? So there basically are 2 major types of zoning. The conventional approach is called Euclidean zoning. That's what we do here. It's basically a nuisance-based approach to zoning. Basically based on the concept that different uses need to be separated because they're incompatibilities. So residential uses can't be located next to commercial uses because for some reason they're incompatible, right? A lot of it goes back to what happened during the Industrial Revolution, where you actually had polluting industries in cities. So there actually was a reason why certain uses couldn't be located next to residences. And sort of when they move those uses out of cities, some say lifespan shot up, obviously, because the polluting industries were not right next to where people were living. And some say that the planners have been trying to replicate that since the glory days, right? They've been trying to replicate that expansion of life since then. So they started separating everything else. And, you know, in the US, we're not as bad here, but some zoning codes are so bad that they have separate zones for barbershops and hair salons. Yeah? So it gets that bad. Basically, Euclidean zoning has a preference for low-density development or suburban development, single-family homes. And basically, it's basically a form of zoning that basically places the automobile at the center of everything. Because everything is so spread out, well, you need a car to get around. Now, there's another type, as really sort of recent, I would say, in the last 10 years. It's really become more popular, called form-based coding or zoning. And basically what it attempts to do is replicate, in a sense, the way that cities organically grow and have done throughout time, right? So there are less restrictions on the separation of uses and more regulation of how buildings look, the heights of buildings, the intensity of the land use, right? Whether it's residential or commercial, they just look at the intensity of the land use, the scale of the buildings, how the buildings relate to the sidewalk. So the overall goal of a form-based code really is to create a more pedestrian-friendly and vibrant public space by looking at the way that private buildings impact upon what happens in the public space, right? Form-based codes tend to be based on a concept known as a transect. So it starts basically thinking that development, you have a gradation of development, basically starting from the most rural land that has no development, or the natural zone, gradually getting more intense as you get to the central business district of a city, right? And just to give you an example of how we don't do that today, again, I was working with a client, and they had some land close to City Gate. So they got a planning permission from Town and Country to develop the site. And basically, Town and Country planning required the same amount of parking spaces on this site, right? A site directly adjacent to City Gate, that they would have required for a site out in the suburbs or out in a rural area where there's absolutely no public transportation. So it's almost like a one-size-fits-all approach, right? There's no sort of difference between the context of where the development is located, and that's kind of how we're doing things now. So the question arises, does the typical Euclidean zoning, is that a deterrent to sort of this traditional urbanism, or this sort of organic urbanism, or the way that places develop naturally? Andres Duani, who is an urban planner and architect, says that the problem is that a lot of places that we love and tourists love to visit, basically you couldn't build those places today in their current locations because the zoning codes have changed. They no longer allow a lot of these things to happen, right? So just some images of some neighborhoods that are very popular. This one is in Baltimore, Maryland. This is in Manhattan, Santa Fe, New Mexico, and this is Port of Spain, where it used to be. And the question is, can these things still be built today? A lot of people love the overhangs of the buildings that provide the shade on the sidewalk. And it's a question as to if the regulations today would allow these things. I'm not too sure that they would. This is just a map of a zoning map, basically, right, for the city of Port of Spain. And this is how they sort of regulate the land uses in Port of Spain, or what's allowed to be built. And basically, the brown shows the shades of brown show residential areas where you can build residences, and red is commercial, and of course there's some other uses. But basically, what it's showing you is that they've more or less segregated commercial uses in particular areas and residential uses in particular areas, right? There's hardly allowances for mixed uses, though that has changed somewhat, but it's still not ideal. Let's get that. So basically, how do we achieve walkability through a zoning code, right? How does a zoning code impact on walkability? one of the ways is, okay, density. So you allow more people to live within a given area, right? So how does that impact walkability? Well, it impacts the useful walk, right? So you now have more people living in the area, so that area can now support more services. You can now have more retail or wider variety of services to support that area, right? So walking then becomes useful because, hey, I can get to all these different things within a short walk, right? The safe walk, because if you have more people in the area, chances are the streets are going to be more active at different times of the day, and it's going to be that sense of security of people using the streets because they know there are other people on the streets as well, right? How do things like setbacks, or basically how far the building is from the sidewalk, and how high the building is elevated above the sidewalk, how do these things impact walkability? Well, in one way, the safe walk, smaller front setbacks means there's more engagement between the people who are in the buildings, right, because of that physical closeness, and the people who are on the sidewalk, right? So people who are in the buildings, they may be on their front porch, they see what's going on the sidewalk, so there's that connection between the building user and the street user, right, that's safety. The comfortable walk, which actually I'll talk about next slide. The interesting walk, because there's people using the buildings, there's that social interaction between people who are in the buildings and the sidewalk, you know. If there's somebody on the porch, you know, you're walking by, you wave, you say good morning or whatever, and, you know, there's that sort of intimate connection between you and the person, or you don't know the person, right? So yeah, this, I think, illustrates well the concept of the comfortable walk. And one of the things that urban designers have been saying is that humans like to feel comfortable in the spaces, right? So they like these spaces to sort of feel like an outdoor room. So what does that mean? Well, the walls of the buildings on either side of the street act as the walls of the room. If you have nice street trees with a nice full canopy, that sort of acts as the ceiling of the room. So it almost feels like an enclosed space, right? So this is an example of a pedestrian promenade in Barcelona, which is one of their most important tourist attractions. These are just some images that I took while I was walking one day in Port of Spain. And I wanted to show the impact of the setbacks of buildings and their height on shading on the street, right? In the tropics, east-west streets, midday, sort of very difficult to shade because of the direction of the sun overhead, right? And one of the things that we want to do is shade streets, especially in this climate, right? So this is by Victoria Square, this street right here, an east-west street. So you see like no shade basically, right? Okay, a few blocks down, another east-west street. Because of how close the buildings are on either side of the road and how narrow the road is, the buildings provide shade as well as the tree, right? So because you have this smaller space now, there's that shading of the buildings on the street, right? And because the setbacks of the buildings, well, there is no setback because the building goes right up to the sidewalk, right? Okay, the next day I was walking, this is what I saw. They had basically massacred all of the trees, right? Which I think is a good example to show why you need both, right? You need the buildings as well as the landscaping to provide that shade, because look what can happen to the landscaping if you depend on that alone to provide shade and make the street comfortable to walk on. By allowing mixed uses, you can allow for walkability. Again, I talked about before, street activity at different times of the day, basically because different uses have different activity times, and useful walk because you can reach the different amenities. Now there are other considerations that could go into a zoning code that could affect walkability. Parking is one of those huge ones. If you have, the ideal situation really is to have parking off-site, not on the same site as the use, and in shared facilities. One of the reasons is actually quite practical, because if you have a driveway at every lot, think of a place like Woodbrook, right? You have, every lot is about 50 feet wide. If you have a driveway every 50 feet, that means as a pedestrian you have a point of conflict with a car every 50 feet, right? It's not a very nice thing to be walking, and then the sidewalk goes down and up, right? It also takes away on-street parking spaces from the local government. So they're bringing parking meters into the city of Port of Spain now, right? Well, you just lost basically a space to gain revenue from parking, right? Because this is driveway, then you can't park in front of the driveway, obviously. So really, the ideal thing is to have parking in shared facilities in a place like Port Spain, probably multi-story car parks. And I think what you really want to try to do is sort of decouple the parking from the use, right? So let people pay for the parking separately. Because what ends up happening is that once it is coupled in with the use, you end up paying for the parking whether or not you realize it or not, because the developer has paid to provide that parking, whether it is that they provided structured parking or underground parking. They've paid for it, right? And that price has already gone into the cost of your housing or the cost of the goods and services, because they now have to charge higher rents. So by decoupling it, it means that people who don't own cars are not paying to subsidize the people who own cars, right? And that automatic subsidy of the parking is not built in. Some other factors, vehicle speed, we have to work to, get the streets and the travel speeds on the streets lower. Windows and balconies on buildings help again with that sense of social contact on the street, right? And again on parking, I got these figures really from a local quantity surveyor, and it's really staggering. He says that for above ground structured parking, each space costs anywhere from $122,000 to $135,000 TT dollars to provide. When you provide it underground, the costs go 30% higher. So just an illustration of the fact that parking is extremely expensive, and we don't even realize that that cost really is built into everything. The movie ticket at Movie Town, because they provided parking, they have to now charge more money to recoup their costs, everything. We don't think about it, but how much space does parking take up, right? Just 2 parking spaces plus the aisle space needed to get the cars in and out of the spaces takes up about 650 square feet, or the size of a studio apartment. A 1 to 2 bedroom apartment on average could be about 975 square feet, which is 4 cars, right? 4 parking spaces. A 2 bedroom apartment at West Hills in Pitty Valley, I showed West Hills in one of the earlier slides, about 875 square feet. So think about how much space the parking itself is actually taking up compared to the living space, right? And if that doesn't show that we need to find a way to reduce our dependence on automobiles, well, I don't really know what else will. And again, just to stress on the importance of density, because I think we have a huge antipathy to density here. And I sort of mentioned this before, but one of the things that, when we write plans and we say things like vibrant, safe neighborhood and all that, right? It sounds great as a goal for a plan, right? But then if the zoning code doesn't allow you to build at a density that allows for that sort of vibrancy to happen, because you have to have enough people using the area, or preferably a mix of people living there and visiting, to have that vibrancy, right? So one of the interesting things is that Jane Jacobs, who I would have talked about before, she said, quoted as saying she's never seen a neighborhood in a city with less than 250 dwelling units per hectare that is vibrant. 250 dwelling units per hectare is about 11 housing units on your average 5,000 square foot lot. So she says that I've never seen a neighborhood, well, I've hardly seen a neighborhood that has less density than that is a vibrant neighborhood. So I say that it's really important to change our zoning code, right? And I can imagine the skeptics saying, well, no one follows the law here, right? I mean, people just do what they want. Who cares about what town and country plan says you have to do? But I think that we really haven't stopped to think about a lot of the factors that go into why people don't follow the rules. And I think one is this whole idea of community versus state responsibility. So we think that the state is the one who's primarily responsible for enforcing the law. And it comes from something that Jane Jacobs said, which says that the law is really kept by the community, primarily. The state is comes on top of that as another layer, right? If you have to depend on the state to enforce law everywhere, you're never going to have law and order, right? So when the organic, casual community enforcement of law has broken down, no amount of police or state enforcement is going to fix that problem, right? So we have in a sense, created that problem by weakening communities in the way that we've designed them. And also it doesn't help that the general public doesn't know what the regulations are, because we don't publish them for the general public to know, right? So that is also a huge thing. I mean, today I could go online and find the zoning code for any city in the United States of America, even Native American settlements, right? And we still don't know what those things are locally. Realistic regulations. The urban economist Alain Berthaud, he worked with the World Bank. He was the chief urban planner of the World Bank for many years. And he wrote something the other day that really struck me. He said that basically that when urban planning regulations don't take into account market realities, there's no way to enforce them, right? So what he's saying is that when a large portion of the population cannot afford the housing, right, or the cost of housing that is created by urban planning regulations, there's no way that any government is going to be able to stop people from illegal development. And he makes a point. He says that in places where you have weak enforcement, which typically tends to be the developing world, it's going to show up as illegal land subdivision. And we're all too familiar with that, right? Squatting. Then he says it happens in the developed world as well. When you have strong enforcement, it just shows up in a different way. It shows up as illegal building subdivisions. And he states, he quotes data showing that in New York City, over a decade, I think from 2000 to 2010, there were 100,000 illegal building subdivisions, so illegal units created in buildings, right? So we like to think of, the United States as being this great country when it comes to enforcement, right? Everyone says, well, you can't get away with anything with those Yankees, But guess what? It still happens there because New York City is a very expensive place to live, and if people can't afford the housing, or a large portion of the population, guess what? That's going to happen. So I think it's important for us when we're crafting urban planning regulations to take into account the impact it's going to have on the cost of housing, right? And just to finish off, I'll just leave you with 3 videos that I think sort of show, well, the first 2 are going to show how we need to sort of look at the development of streets, right, as a complement to the zoning code to fix our urban areas. And the third video is just going to show the overall picture, right, of areas, sort of a different approach to development, basically, right?
Standing in Times Square, where you see a lot of activity. You hear a band playing behind me. You can see people sitting out, having a coffee, chatting, catching up with friends. And it sort of seems natural, even on a cold, blustery winter day here where it's 40 degrees in New York City. All of these are the kind of type of things that wouldn't have happened a couple years ago because there wasn't enough room on the sidewalks, and this great attraction that people come from all around the world to see was pretty much dedicated towards cars.
It's important to remember that as much as some people drive, that fewer than half of all New Yorkers own cars, so we need to make a city that works for commuters, for drivers, for cyclists, for pedestrians, and for folks of every age, for young, for old, for in between.
When we look at people that are going into city planning and people that are working as city managers, they're beginning to think differently about how cities function. And they're not thinking that the highway is terribly important for central business districts.
It's okay to keep a couple high-speed roads like the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway to keep us moving around from one part of the city to the other, but it's not okay to tune every one of our streets for that purpose. And so the work that New York City is doing in spots like this is helping bring back more life to the streets. And the rest of the neighborhoods around the city and around the country that are moving towards this approach are also going to benefit.
First thing to note is that this is not just a bike lane. It's what we call complete street design. We had a very wide avenue with 5 lanes in it already, and they were 12 feet wide lanes. So rather than take out a lane, we actually just kept the same number of lanes but made them a little narrower, which has the side benefit of slowing down the traffic.
Columbus Avenue, before the bike lane was in, used to be the width of a highway. It's often, even sometimes still, like a Grand Prix out there, but the bike lane and the traffic islands make it so much easier to cross the street. They're like a little oasis.
So you can see that people will come right through. Here's a left car coming through, and he's going to wait because he's going through the islands and wait for the pedestrians to pass. So it really is helpful for people with baby carriages and strollers, older people with walkers and wheelchairs. You can observe them on the street stopping in these islands and taking a breath before moving on.
When I saw that there was going to be a whole lane of parked cars between me on my bike and the traffic, I was really quite ecstatic. Before the lanes, I would have avoided Columbus Avenue because there are too many huge trucks. And now it's a completely different story. I could ride happily on Columbus.
At least 2/3 of our staff commute by bike every day into the store, and so it's only helped them get to and from work, having that bike lane there.
Our business is like a lot of delivery. It's good for business or good for city, protect for myself, the delivery guy. And they get used to that. It's wonderful. Yeah, they love it.
I think especially for the bikers and what I heard at the community board meeting, that they need a safe place to ride, and we've been, like I said, all for it, and we think it's great. All of our vendors have been able to get here. They never really have a huge problem with parking. It hasn't affected our shipments. We have a bus stop in front of the store anyway, so we've always had to be cautious about how our shipments are coming in and out of the store.
And eventually, hopefully very soon, we'll be planting trees and flowers in these tree pits, and it's a way for the community to become involved in the plantings. It's another amenity and unexpected outcome from the bike lane.
What we have here on 1st and 2nd Avenue on the east side of Manhattan is an attempt to really change the street. We've got a dedicated bus lane. We've got a dedicated bike lane. We have these lanes somewhat protected. The goal here is basically to create a street that is more friendly for pedestrians, that is more friendly for bicyclists, and that is more friendly for traditional car users as well as commuters who commute by bus.
I think complete streets are really an important reshaping of the streets so that they reflect the number of people that are being moved by each mode. Buses move a great number of people, so providing and dedicating a lane for buses makes a lot of sense.
I take the Select bus over there. Oh, that is great. It gets me uptown much quicker time. When they said they were going to get a limited that would come up and down these avenues quicker, I said, oh, yeah. But the lanes have made a big difference, so they're fast, and you get on fast.
People in the east side of Manhattan are 3 times more likely to commute by walking to and from work than anywhere else in the city. The intersection just north of here is one of the most dangerous intersections in this entire corridor, and some of these improvements are intended directly to make the intersections safer for pedestrians.
I love the island. The traffic's coming out from here, and they can't just zoom around. They have to wait for you. It gives you more time to cross, and there's not a lot of time on this light here. So it's a help.
I support the Prospect Park West redesign. I think it's a great example of a community-driven project. The community board asked for it, both to reduce speeding and calm traffic on Prospect Park West, and to create a safe place to bike and to make Prospect Park West safer for all its users.
Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, we had a big push for traffic calming. At the same time, the Bloomberg administration was moving toward adding bike lanes. When it came to Prospect Park West, it seemed a perfect opportunity to combine the two, to both narrow, it was a 3-lane, a racetrack essentially, while providing a very important link in the bicycle path system around the city. So the Community Board 6 Transportation Committee, jumped on that and felt that it was a worthwhile project.
So a lot of people who live on Prospect Park West have reported to me that before it felt to them like living on a speedway. I drive, and I remember, you could zoom in and out of those 3 lanes, and there was something fun about it, but it was dangerous. And I think folks who drove it knew it, and folks who lived there felt it.
A road like this, by slowing down the motor speeds from about just under 35 miles an hour to just above 25 miles an hour, that begins to make a dramatic increase in pedestrian safety for lots of reasons. Cars are more likely to yield to them. cars. The stopping distance is shorter once they spot a pedestrian in the roadway. And even in the unfortunate incident of there being an impact, the likelihood of severe injury is less at the slower speeds.
Before the project went into effect, more than 3/4 of cars were speeding, and now it's only about 1 in 5.
Since they put the new traffic system in, it's been fantastic. I'm not a bicycle rider, but even without the bicycle path, I like the traffic calming.
We love the new bike path. I'm out here a lot with my boys. We live in the North Slope. We take it all the way down to Bartle Pritchard Square, then we cut into the park and we hit the soccer fields. And the best thing about it is I can get home now. I never used to be able to get home. And now we have a two-way bike lane, so it's safe both directions.
It's just very calm and it's very civilized. I didn't have to ride on the sidewalk like I used to. I actually felt safe. I didn't feel like anything was going to hit me. And other bicyclists were obeying the traffic signals and stopping when they were supposed to stop.
I'll tell you that as a cyclist and as just someone who's walking his dog all the time, I like the new design. It slows down the neighborhood, and a beautiful park next to a beautifully designed street. It's fantastic.
Important that we find ways to make our communities more accessible to all the people who want to use them and allow for kinds of transportation that are more sustainable in the long run.
It's increased our foot traffic. I mean, that was something we anticipated, was having the bike lane in would draw more people into the store just because it's more accessible.
As New York is changing its streets where people drive in a more civil fashion, it just brings out even more people who walk, more people who bike, more people who don't get in a car.
Cars are not bad. I mean, they're very useful, but I think the changes are better for the city. I think it promotes people to be healthier. We need people to be healthier.
The protected bike lanes are part of a broad vision of a city that is friendly to more than just the automobile, and it will take time for people to become accustomed to sharing the streets in this new way.
We're also beginning to restore the streets as places that we once saw in our great neighborhoods from 50, 60, 70, 100 years ago. And this is important because it helps make the local economies more vibrant, it makes the neighborhoods more enriched, but also it returns people to the ability to walk and bike around.
People have countered, they've said there's problems for people who live in the area who have cars. There may be inconvenience, but I think you have to sometimes trade off inconvenience for safety, and safety is paramount.
For the most part, what media looks for is a story, and a story that things are going well just doesn't make it to the headlines. But if people are complaining, and people complain about almost anything, it will get itself into the newspapers. But I can tell you from my point of view, and I'm the Dear Abby of traffic, if a driver has a complaint, they will write to Gridlock Sam. I haven't been getting complaints. No complaints about 1st, 2nd Avenues, no complaints about the 9th Avenue or 8th Avenue bike lanes. So the drivers seem to be adjusting to it. I think we're moving almost as many people in cars as we moved before.
You can see the bikes coming. Watch them. Watch them. Oh, it is much more visible. You can see the bikes, you can see the cars. The only thing you have to do is not to just step out because you see an island here and when the light's against you. That's very important that people have to learn that.
So the second video is pretty similar. It's one in Detroit. It takes a different sort of approach, but it's pretty similar. So I'll skip it because we're running on kind of long here. But I thought this last video is useful to look at.
Major funding for American Makeover and sustainable party kits.
Check it out, y'all.
Well, Atlanta has been called Sprawlanta. You know, it's the capital of sprawl. Look in the dictionary, it'll say, see Atlanta.
Rectangle. Ripping it up, giving it up, yo, we living it up.
In the late 90s, Chris Lineberger actually referred to Atlanta as the fastest growing human settlement in the history of the planet.
Atlanta is the poster child of suburban sprawl, and it's everywhere. It's as far as the eye can go.
Atlanta's been a classic example of the drive till you qualify, affordable model, where the cheap land, the cheap housing is out at the edge.
This is a metro region where only 10% of the population lives in the city proper. 90% lives in the outlying towns and communities.
Extremely long commutes. The average employed Atlantan drives 66 miles a day.
Got a question for you. I'll put it down with efficiency like things you want places.
There are no natural boundaries to stop Atlanta's growth. There are no mountains, there are no major oceans, and so there's nothing to say that we just won't sprawl to the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, it's like, never mind Charlotte and the rest of those cities in this way.
Atlantans every day drive the distance cumulatively that would take us to the sun and partway back. Every single day. All of those cars burning lots of gasoline generate lots of pollution.
As a matter of fact, in 2009, Forbes magazine rated Atlanta the most toxic city in the country. I'm breathing secondary smoke. No, I'm not talking about cigarettes, I'm talking about cars.
We know more and more that both ozone and particulate matter are major hazards to respiratory and cardiovascular health. But that's not all. We know that being in a car is one of the most dangerous microenvironments we've got. Car crashes are the major cause of death among young people in this country.
It's not just riding in a car that's dangerous. All over Atlanta, you see folks trying to get across 8 lanes of traffic, 1 lane at a time, like some sort of morbid version of the game Frogger.
It takes a lot of strength from within to believe that the angels really got you covered.
3 pedestrians are struck by automobiles every week in Atlanta. 60 people were killed by cars while on foot in 2008. Over 1,000 people were injured. That's more than 1 Atlantan a week who's killed by a car because of the way we built the city. Margaret Mitchell, the author of Gone with the Wind, was killed crossing Peachtree Street, hit by a car.
Several things happened kind of all at once that introduced me to new urbanism, and somebody mentioned this book by Andres Duany or something, they mispronounced his name. So I bought Suburban Nation, read it in a night, and I just got hooked. What do you have to do to become a developer? You just have to say you are one, and you are one. So we stepped in, held a charrette at the very end of 01. 02 was about permitting, and 03 was about infrastructure, and I think it was 04 when we started finally building the buildings. And here in 2010, it's mainly done.
My name is Kevin Clark. I'm a partner with Historical Concepts. I'm an architect, a lead AP, urban designer. My background here is that I've been living here for about 4.5 years and have been working here for about 3.5. Colonial Park is so unique. It's right here in town. We're 1.5 miles from the state capitol. Every resident has a place to grab coffee, grab a bite to eat. My 200-foot walk to work is pretty unique, I would say, among Atlantans and probably most folks. Prior to this, I was actually commuting about 35 miles one way to the office. one of the great things is the happenstance occurrences. It's running into my neighbor as he's getting home from work and walking into his condo. And he says, "Hey, do you want to grab a beer later tonight?" Or, "Hey, we're playing trivia at the Mexican restaurant. You want to come and grab an enchilada and have a beer?" Absolutely. If I had lived more of a suburban lifestyle, if I would pass one of my neighbors, the way I would say hi to him is by honking my car. Think about the difference of honking your car at somebody versus waving and saying hi, have a conversation with them, and so on and so forth.
To me, the key concept is walkability. And what makes for walkability? Well, one thing is there has to be somewhere to go. So that means compact, and your destinations aren't too far away. It means there's a mix of different elements, a park, recreational facilities, and it's an empirical fact that for a place to be walkable, it has to be interesting and beautiful, and clearly it has to be safe from crime, and even more importantly, safe from the damn cars. And so getting the whole street geometry thing right becomes incredibly critical.
If you drive down some of the subdivisions that we would associate really with sprawl, you often find snout houses where the garage is really what projects out from the body of the house, and the garage is the most visible thing. It looks like cars live there. Back behind the garage, maybe you find the front door to the house. Whereas if you go to places like Glenwood Park or more traditional neighborhoods, you see porches that are not for cars, they're for people.
Garages are in the back. That allows you to keep the trash and the kind of ugliness off the street. And really what it does is it gets you to use your front door a lot more. Here, I probably knew 5 or 6 people within the first day. And I continue to know my neighbors. I know their families. I know their stories. I know their jobs. They know mine.
Great neighborhood. It's very convenient to everything.
It's always somewhere to go and eat, someone to talk to.
I think the actual design is more of a community-based design where you have your retail, your food, and all that stuff contained within a small area versus suburbia where you have to drive maybe 2-3 miles to get to your favorite restaurant, or the closest restaurant, I should say, maybe not even your favorite.
Neighborhoods like Glenwood incorporate many of the features that we increasingly recognize promote good health. More physical activity, more social interaction, helping to build community. Also, something that's very good for health. Less driving, which improves air quality. Less driving, which reduces the risk of being in car crashes, and so on. So this is an example of a neighborhood design that incorporates many strategies that really are public health strategies.
I did clock it when I first moved here. I lost 10 pounds in the first 6 months that I lived here. Didn't change my diet, didn't change anything. It was just a different way of living.
Well, this notion that new urbanism is...
All right, that brings me to the end of the presentation. I think we'll take some questions now if anybody has questions. Dr. Townsend. People acting as traffic engineer. I would say the two things that I spoke about, the zoning code as one thing, and then looking at how we deal with traffic on the streets. To give you an example, I brought up the example earlier of the Savannah. How they raise the speed limit around Savannah. And Savannah, as it stands, is probably one of our most popular pedestrian areas. It's a high level of pedestrian activity around that area. And what we basically done by that small decision there is make the place less friendly to pedestrians, right? So you can do little things like that. Instead, I think that what they should have done was probably have some traffic calming at the Savannah, because I mean, people were already driving there at high speeds anyway, I think, but the fact that you've now said it's okay to do it is pretty problematic. You could have had some traffic calming measures. You could have had raised crosswalks at particular places. There's large stretches in between the crosswalks. Sometimes people have a hard time crossing the road. People who are coming from St. Anne's or Cascade who need to cross that road and go to Savannah, they have a very difficult time. The school children from Belmont Secondary have a very difficult time because to get to that traffic light, that first one, if they're heading towards town, the sidewalk is very narrow on that side to even get to that traffic light, right? And there are a lot of obstructions on the sidewalk itself, so they sort of try to run across the road and get to the Savannah side as soon as, well, right by the intersection there. In terms of the zoning code, and why I think this is so important is because, well, one of the things is we need more people to be living in Port of Spain, right? I think the biggest problem that Port of Spain has is that it's kind of a dead city at night. There aren't many people living in Port of Spain. The population is about 36,000, somewhere around there. Last census may have dropped even further with the new census coming up, we don't know. The zoning code influences that to a large extent. Residential development in a lot of the city's neighborhoods is just not financially feasible because of the cost of the land and what you are allowed to build on the land. So you have a place like Woodbrook where regulations today, technically, they may make allowances, but technically, on a typical 5,000 square foot lot of land, which is a typical Woodbrook lot, you may be able to build 3 residential units, right? A lot of land in Woodbrook could be around $2 million market value. So, okay, you can build 3 residential units. Now, if you pay $2 million for your land, if a developer comes in and buys the land and wants to build residential units, you now have to spread that $2 million over the cost of over basically 3 units. So each unit, the cost, without even considering construction costs, is already elevated to a level that's ridiculously high because you've only been allowed to build 3 units on the land. So something like that is controlled by the zoning code, and if the zoning code were relaxed a bit, I think we would see a lot more residential development in Port of Spain. Actually, as it stands, if you look at the statistics, and I've seen some numbers, there are hundreds of applications for residential development in Port of Spain that have been refused in the last 10 years for reasons like, the developer wants too many units on a lot of land, or the building is 1 foot too close to the boundary, or, sort of ridiculous reasons. So I think the zoning code has to be realistic about the type of development that happens in urban areas. What we've done basically is impose suburban design standards on the urban areas. So we've come up with our regulations to fit suburban areas. Then we just sort of tweak them a little bit and try to put them into urban areas, but it doesn't work because of the cost of land in urban areas. Land is used differently. You can't have large setbacks between buildings on 5,000 square foot lots of land because you're not using the land efficiently, right? In any city you go to, you're going to have buildings that have 0 setback lines. A place like, if you go to Manhattan, you see all these brownstones. Well, technically, each brownstone is on its own lot of land, right? And there's 0 setback between the neighboring properties, right? So we don't allow that for residential development in the city for some reason. It's allowed for commercial development. Once you have what you call a firewall in between the buildings, right, to prevent the spread of fire. And so things like that, I think the zoning code is by far the single most important thing affecting the feasibility of development in the city. But also, if the zoning code prescribes a certain design or type of development, or the way that the city is shaped in a way that doesn't allow for that sort of interaction. So what tends to happen is that the zoning codes prescribe very large front setbacks, so the building has to be set back very far from the sidewalk, right, which basically kills that interaction between, as I said, what's going on in the building and what's going on in the sidewalk. They have pretty high parking requirements considering in the middle of Port of Spain. Tend to be about 1.5 parking spaces per unit. I mentioned the cost of parking and how that impacts on development, right? So it's going to exacerbate the cost of the housing. How many people can afford to pay millions and millions of dollars for a housing unit? And they're probably, given the state of Port of Spain, not going to want to pay for it in Port of Spain right now the way they exist. They're going to go to West Moorings or, or Federation Park or something. So yeah, I think the zoning code affects us in so many different ways. And it's something that the zoning code for Port of Spain really haven't changed since 1989 about. It's, since about 1989. It hasn't really changed. So it's not realistic for the realities of today, certainly. Maybe it was, considering how Woodbrook was a suburban neighborhood. It's no longer a suburban neighborhood, and that's, part of the problem is we haven't recognized that and changed to suit today's context. Yes. Who makes the decision at the end of the day for decisions like that? Is it the PS or so for instance, the situation with the Savannah, then who at the end of the day would have made the decision to increase the speed limit? The politician, okay. Yeah. Yes. I think, in one of the videos that I showed, the one in Atlanta, I think they mentioned that 10% of the population of the metropolitan area lives in the city core. I think it's actually less here, if you think about it, because Port of Spain's population, if it's about 34,000, metropolitan Port of Spain could almost be considered almost the entire east-west corridor, which is roughly 600,000 people if you're looking at it. So it's even less population living in the city core than our situation in Atlanta. The population loss, the city at its peak had about 100,000 people living in it. So we're down significantly from that. I think that people rightly brought up, pressure from political pressure from the suburbanites who want to just get in and out of the city very quickly. And I think part of it has to do with part of the problem in making certain changes has to do with the fact that there isn't sort of a large enough constituency living in the city to sort of champion and push back against those things. So I mean, it's all connected, you know. So we sort of have to start somewhere. We may not be able to get many of these changes up front, but as we start maybe moving more people back into the city and you sort of build up the political constituency of the people who live in the city, you may be able to start advocating for some of these changes. I think maybe in some places in the States and other developed countries, you know, some of these things, yeah, okay, maybe they can happen because the government insists it's going to happen and there's that political will to make the city look a particular way, right? But in reality, in a lot of places, even in the States, urban revitalization and bringing people back in is a process, and it tends to be, it's not going to be the people who are wealthy and who can afford to live in the, you know, the West Moorings or whatever, who are going to come back in first. It's going to be typically younger people, people who, you know, are braver or who value that living in that urban environment tend to be people who move back in first, or whether it's artists or, you know, and as the city starts to improve and they tend to make the improvements and fight for the improvements, then sort of the other people start to want to come in after that. So I think it's a process. We can't really expect all of the improvements to be made beforehand. The process has to start somewhere. And I think already, based on sort of the figures I was telling you about, there's already a market demand for people to want to live in Port of Spain based on what the developers are trying to build, because they know their clients, they know what they can sell, right? So if they are trying to get apartments built in the neighborhoods in Port of Spain, but the planning system is saying, no, you can't build it for these whatever reasons, right? There's a demand for people to move back in. And it's not surprising given where we are right now. The cost of gas has increased, right? Because subsidies are being removed or have been removed fully, I'm not too sure. And the traffic situation, you know, we've sprawled so much and people now have these ridiculous commutes on a daily basis, and it's just getting worse. So people may be willing to live in Port of Spain to be closer to their job, even though it's not, you know, it doesn't look like New York City, you know, but as a start, I think we need to start getting people back in. And I think the city is going to improve with time as people start moving back in. Yeah. Does that sort of answer the... Okay. Monica. Hey. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. What I would say is that I think they currently in the last budget there are incentives for the construction of housing, right? And what I always thought was that they should not be blanket incentives, that they should be tied to geographical areas, because the building of houses in particular areas has greater benefits than the building of houses in other areas, right? More positive externalities. Commercial, yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's concentrated in particular neighborhoods. I don't think it's. Yeah, but it's not. It's not. I won't say it's everywhere, but yeah, definitely in sort of the neighborhoods that we tend to frequent more often, probably like Woodbrook and St. James and Belmont. Yeah. Well, not everywhere in East Port of Spain, but yeah, in Belmont in particular, yeah. But I think it's related to Onika's point about the overall supply of housing, which is being, again, I think, stymied by planning regulations, because I mean we only have so much land to build, and if people can't build densely enough, right, then the overall housing supply is going to be low. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, yeah. Mm. I think it's, well, I think it's two things. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, yeah. Okay, so you just answered part of it. I was going to say two things. One is that some of those things you're talking about actually haven't been implemented by the actual planners themselves. So when applications come into the offices and something is announced, let's say you can now build 2 units on your lot of land, but when you, as an applicant, go into the division and you deal with the planners there, some reason they haven't heard about it, or they, that's one thing. But I think too, because I've had this conversation with a lot of more seasoned planners, and they've told me about things that they tried to do over the years, in particular getting residential development back into Port of Spain. I know one talks a lot about what happened after the coup and all these incentives they put in after things burned down and all that kind of stuff, right? I think one of the things that hasn't been looked at carefully enough, and I sort of mentioned it in the presentation, is the economics of it. Because what hasn't changed really, they may have allowed extra density, but for instance, a policy was done some years ago. I don't think it ever materialized or it was ever used, but so they allowed extra density on lots, right? But on top of that, they started requiring larger setbacks because they were giving extra density. So it became a situation where if you had a single lot of land and you wanted to build something, the setbacks were so large now because they've given you this extra density, they feel like you now have to give bigger setbacks, right? That you can't build anything on a lot of land. It requires amalgamation of lots. How many people have the money to amalgamate lots? I don't think we can sort of hinge everything on large developers who have the money to amalgamate multiple lots of land. We have to write the regulations in such a way that someone who owns one lot of land can develop that lot of land feasible, in an economically feasible way. And again, a lot of that has to do with parking requirements. And sometimes, if you're at a particular density, you can't fit the parking. It's just very difficult to fit parking on site on a 5,000 square foot lot because of the dimensions of parking, right? So I think a lot of it has to do with not taking into account the economic side of the cost of parking and other things, and also the fact that sometimes the regulations are written with people envisioning that people are going to amalgamate lots to build these developments. Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the things I didn't really mention actually is that when I was talking about the form-based code, it was actually a project that I worked on at Town and Country Planning for over a year, and it was basically scrapped at the end of it, right? So it was really a project to reform the land use regulations, and so sort of gone back to, as Dr. Mohammed pointed out, we've reverted. Speak to me after. I think I have another question, but I just wanted to make one point before, which is that and it's something that I've given this talk in a similar way before, right? One thing I try to do is focus on the things that we as planners, as architects, as engineers don't think about. So the other allied professions and widen the umbrella. So we don't talk a lot about economics and how economics is related to what we do and the built environment. Like, we really don't talk. We talk a lot about environmental stuff, but we don't talk about economics. And really and truly, a lot of decisions are made because of economic reasons, right? Whether it's at the individual level or whether it's the government trying to increase economic activity or spur economic activity. So if we can sort of make the case for why what we want to do helps the economy or helps people's pockets, I think we have a stronger case. I think it's something that we tend to overlook a lot. We tend to think that because we know in our minds that something is good, that other people are going to see it the same way or relate it or be as logical as we think we are, but we haven't been able to really touch that part of them that really makes them want to get on board with our ideas. Really. Yeah, that's a question. Okay, so two questions. All right. The first question, and I'll say this because it has been said in the public domain already. So I was watching one of those joint select committee meetings that was broadcast live, and a representative from Town and Country Planning told the committee that sometimes they don't know what the policy is for an area because it's incomplete. They don't know sometimes what is allowed to be built in certain areas. So what they tend to do is that they will go into what they call their vault and pull what they call a cross-reference or an application that was done in the area, and they say, well, what did we do when that application came in? And they'll kind of sort of figure out what to do based on what they did last time, right? But sometimes they don't have a comprehensive sort of document that says this is what the policies are for every area of the country. So they can't publish it because they don't have it as one reason. There are other reasons, but I'll just leave you with that reason. In terms of the second question was about interacting with them while they develop, and that's done in other places in other countries. That's kind of how it's done. Particularly if you're talking about things like form-based codes, they tend to be done with what you call design charrettes, where the members of the community basically come together and come up with what they want their community to look like. And then the professionals then basically write the code that's going to allow that to materialize then, right? The code that controls what the development is going to look like based on what the community has said they want. So it's done, but yeah, we don't do it here. We just don't do it. And actually, when I was working on that form-based code at Town and Country Planning, we sort of started that process because we had, I think for the first time in a very long time, there was consultations initially with the Port of Spain City Corporation, the Trinidad and Tobago Society of Planners, and the Institute of Architects. So that was like the first phase of consultations where I sort of went through the code with them, and they gave feedback and changes were to be made to the code based on their feedback. And so it was supposed to be sort of a collaborative process. I had sort of started with a sort of a bare bones code that their input would have added to. And the idea was that that was supposed to be taken to public consultation after. And yeah, well, the project just didn't happen, right? So it was scrapped. Yeah. Does that answer the question? Fair enough. I think we have a question in the back. They pulled it down. Yeah. Yeah. No problem. Well, I'll tell you something, an interesting story. So I write in the Newsday. I've kind of slowed down now, but I was writing every week. But a young man reached out to me. He was reading the column, and he runs sort of a bicycle advocacy group. And it's a group of people. He's a doctor at Port of Spain General. He lives in the East, and they ride to Port of Spain, and they ride to work. So he was really excited by the things I was writing about. He's like, "Yeah, I relate to everything you're saying." And he came to my house one day and he brought a bike for me, and we went riding around my neighborhood. And he was telling me they do bike rides in the Port of Spain area regularly. So I just thought it's a nice example to show that things are changing. Things will change. I guess that desire for change is building up slowly at that sort of grassroots. We're looking for grassroots level, but at the individual level. It may not be happening where the government is coming in and installing bike lanes, but I think as the demand starts to grow at that level and people show a desire that they want this. I mean, we have the example of people using the Savannah. I mean, it's not the best example, but it's still something. It's a start. So I mean, little things are happening here and there. Yeah. Oh. Yeah, I mean, that's just more of a management issue. Not too much, I guess, a land use planning issue, but more a management issue and how people manage vendors and sort of the enforcement of the city corporation and what goes on in the city. Just to sort of take it in a different direction, there are things that you can actually do to improve sidewalk conditions, for instance, through a land use regulatory mechanism, right? So what is done right now in downtown Port of Spain is that the way that they measure a setback or how far the building has to be from the sidewalk, right? They measure it from the curb, right? And they say it has to be, I think, 3 or 4 meters from the curb in certain parts of downtown Port of Spain. The thing is that the property line for individual properties may fall into that setback. So actually, that space that's left for the sidewalk, that 4 meters, may actually intrude upon a property line, right? So something like that, which already has precedence, can be done in areas of the city where there are narrow sidewalks to increase the width of the sidewalk over time as redevelopment happens. If you just use that same mechanism and apply it to other parts of the city. So through a land use mechanism, you can increase widths of sidewalks and make it more pedestrian friendly in that way. But yeah, to your other question, I think it's just a matter of management. I mean, I don't know what we can do from sort of with planning tools other than sort of bring actors together to sort of figure out these kinds of management problems. But it's not. Agreed.
character Because in some places you're going to have to do, in some cases you're going to have to advocate, in some cases you're going to have to the pressure. And all those things are going to come up. And I really see that as an opportunity to try to make a change. To try to make a change that we've been all talking about trying to get it done for so long. So that it will actually transcend political directives. I mean, those of us like ourselves take long. Why do we do that? So the 21st of May, people they know we, they will be hearing more from us. I hope we have all of your addresses. And if you haven't had a chance to go to the website, just Google Transportation Symposium UE, and you'll get a chance to see what we did last year. If you want to do this, there's some other things that we do on the blog as well. I'm trying to get Brad more of his talks on the blog as well. And thank you so much for coming in and attending. I'm looking forward to seeing you all. There's going to be something that's happening in April. Yeah, we're going to be trying to utilize panel discussion on the private sector participation in public transportation. And just stay tuned for that. All coming. And have a safe trip.
Thank you for coming.
Make sure